The courthouse stood like a fortress at the center of town, an imposing stone structure with tall windows and heavy wooden doors that had seen decades of trials, scandals, and verdicts. On that morning, however, it seemed to carry a different kind of weight. Reporters crowded the front steps long before the session began, their cameras slung across their shoulders, their notebooks tucked under their arms, waiting for a glimpse of the trial that had drawn national attention. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, as though everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The courtroom itself was a blend of grandeur and unease. High ceilings arched overhead, casting faint echoes of every shuffle of paper, every nervous cough. The polished wooden benches glistened under the soft glow of the chandeliers, but the beauty of the room could not mask the tension that gripped its occupants. Along the gallery, observers whispered to one another, exchanging rumors and predictions, their voices hushed but urgent. The trial had already stretched on for weeks, yet this day felt like the true test, the moment the smallest, most fragile voice would attempt to break the silence surrounding a crime too dark to ignore. At the center of it all sat the defendant. He leaned back in his chair, his face pale but defiant, his jaw set in an expression that was neither remorseful nor fearful. To him, this was still a game of power, and he believed the cards remained in his hands. His attorney occasionally bent close to whisper into his ear, but the man hardly seemed to listen. He smirked faintly, scanning the room as if daring someone to challenge his authority. Many believed that the child set to testify could never muster the courage to face him. The jury filed in, 12 solemn faces carefully composed. Though their eyes betrayed the anxiety they felt about what lay ahead. Each had been warned of the delicate nature of the testimony they were about to hear, yet warnings could never truly prepare them for the reality of it. They carried the weight of responsibility, knowing their decision would not only determine a man's future, but also shape the healing of a little girl who had already endured far too much. The judge entered with the dignity expected of her role, her black robes sweeping behind her. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, but even she seemed softer today. Her gaze swept over the room, lingering on the empty witness stand that awaited the child. With a sharp rap of the gavel, she called the court to order, her voice steady, though the gravity of the moment was not lost on her. Then came the murmurs. Court attendees noticed the unusual request granted for this testimony. A trained police K-9 would be allowed to accompany the little girl to the stand. It was not common practice, and many had questioned the decision. Some critics argued that the presence of a dog could sway the jury emotionally, painting the child in too sympathetic a light. Others insisted it was the only way a child so young could feel safe enough to speak the truth. Regardless of opinion, the ruling had been made. The dog would be there. The bailiff opened the door at the side of the courtroom, and all noise ceased. A hush spread like a wave as small footsteps echoed on the floor. The girl appeared, tiny and fragile, in a pale dress that seemed too big for her slender frame. She clutched tightly to the leash of a large German shepherd, the dog walking calmly at her side. Together, they made their way forward, the contrast between them striking one, so small and delicate, the other strong and steady, his presence commanding yet gentle. Gasps whispered through the room. Reporters' pens froze mid-scribble. The defendant's smirk faltered ever so slightly as his eyes darted toward the child and her companion. The girl's hair fell softly across her face, shielding her expression from the crowd, but her steps, though hesitant, never stopped. She kept her hand firmly on the leash, drawing courage from the warm body walking beside her. The dog, known to officers as Justice, moved with perfect discipline. His ears flicked back at the noise of the courtroom, but his stride never wavered. His calmness was contagious, and as the girl's tiny hand brushed against his fur, she seemed to breathe easier. By the time she reached the witness stand, The trembling in her legs had slowed, replaced by a fragile steadiness. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind as she watched the pair approach. "Good morning," she said gently, her voice carrying across the room like a mother's reassurance. "You may take your seat." The girl glanced at the judge, then quickly back at Justice. She eased into the chair, her small hands still buried in the thick fur of her protector. The dog sat obediently at her feet, his body positioned between her and the man she feared most. It was as if he instinctively understood his role, not merely a companion, but a shield. From the gallery, it was impossible not to feel the emotion of the moment. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter. Journalists who had come expecting just another courtroom spectacle found themselves leaning forward, hearts pounding, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the jurors, trained to keep their faces neutral, showed flickers of empathy, their eyes softening at the sight of the child, braving such an intimidating setting. Across the room, however, the defendant shifted uncomfortably. For the first time during the trial, his confidence wavered. He had counted on her silence, on her fear rendering her useless as a witness. But as he watched her sit there with the dog's steady presence grounding her, a flicker of doubt crept into his expression. The balance of power had shifted, however slightly, and he knew it. The prosecutor rose slowly, gathering his notes, though he hardly glanced at them. His voice was measured, careful not to startle the girl. "We're going to ask you a few questions," he said kindly. "You don't have to be afraid. Justice will be here the whole time. Do you understand?" The girl nodded faintly, her lips pressed together in silence. Her hand never left the dog's fur. The judge gave another reassuring smile. "Take your time. No one is rushing you." And so the room waited. Time seemed to slow as everyone held their breath. Would she speak? Could she find the strength to tell her story in front of strangers, in front of the very man who had tried to take her voice away? The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the steady sound of the dog's calm breathing. It was in that silence that the weight of the moment became clear. This was not just about legal proceedings or courtroom drama. It was about a child's ability to reclaim her courage, about a community's demand for justice, and about the extraordinary bond between a little girl and the dog who had become her anchor. The first words had not yet been spoken, but already the atmosphere had changed. Every person in that room knew they were standing at the edge of something remarkable. And when the girl finally lifted her head, ready to whisper her first words, the courtroom braced itself, fully aware that whatever she said next would not only define the trial, but leave an indelible mark on everyone present. Before the girl ever stepped into that courtroom, her story had already been whispered about in hushed voices across the town. Neighbors spoke of her with sympathy, teachers worried quietly among themselves, and even strangers who barely knew her name felt the pull of her tragedy. She was just 6 years old, small, shy, and wide-eyed, yet she had endured things that most adults could not even imagine. Her childhood should have been filled with laughter and playground games, with sleepovers and bedtime stories. Instead, it had been interrupted by a darkness that no one wanted to believe could exist. For months, perhaps even years, she had carried the heavy secret of what had been done to her. Every time she wanted to speak, fear clamped down on her throat. The threats she had been given, harsh, terrifying words from the very man who was now on trial, kept her silent. At night, when the house grew quiet, the fear returned. Shadows on the wall became monsters. Every creak of the floorboards sent her scrambling beneath the covers, her heart pounding. She dreamed of escape, but even her dreams betrayed her. Pulling her back into the nightmare, she tried so hard to escape during the day. She grew tired, withdrawn, a ghost of the child she should have been. The people around her, her mother, her grandparents, her teachers saw the signs. They saw the way her eyes darted toward the floor when adults asked her questions. They noticed the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the way she curled her hands into fists when someone mentioned his name. But when they tried to press her gently, she shut down completely. The words were trapped inside her, and the fear that telling the truth would bring more pain silenced her every time. It wasn't until the police became involved that the possibility of her testifying emerged. Detectives had gathered evidence, enough to charge the man who had hurt her, but the case hinged on her voice. Without it, the trial might collapse. Without her words, justice might slip away. The thought of speaking in front of strangers, let alone in front of him, terrified her beyond reason. The mere idea of standing in that courtroom, with his eyes locked on her, was enough to send her into tears. Every time an attorney tried to prepare her, she shook her head violently, clutching her stuffed toys as if they could shield her. She whispered the same thing again and again. "I can't. He'll be there." That was when someone suggested the unthinkable. Not a lawyer, not a therapist, but a dog. It wasn't just any dog. The county had recently started a program allowing specially trained Police Canine South to comfort vulnerable witnesses in court. The dog assigned to her case was a German Shepherd named Justice, known for his calm, steady temperament. Unlike humans, he asked for nothing. Unlike adults, he did not press her with questions or tell her she had to be brave. He simply sat there, listening, his warm body beside her like a shield against the world. Their first meeting had been cautious. The girl stood at the edge of the room, her small hands twisted in the hem of her dress, watching as the large dog lay quietly on the floor. He didn't move toward her. He didn't bark. He simply waited. Slowly, she took a step closer, then another, until her fingers brushed the fur along his back. In that moment, something changed. She didn't feel judged. She didn't feel pressured. She didn't even feel afraid. The dog didn't demand her story, he just let her lean against him. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking from nightmares. The next day, she asked if she could see him again. Over the weeks that followed, her connection with Justice deepened. Whenever she stroked his fur, her breathing slowed. When she buried her face against his neck, the tension in her shoulders eased. Slowly, words began to slip out, not to her mother, not to the police, but to Justice. She whispered the things that had happened, testing the sound of them in the safety of his silence. It was as if she believed that as long as the words were spoken only to him, they could not hurt her. Her therapists and handlers noticed the change immediately. Justice became the bridge no adult could build. Through him, she began to find her voice. Yet even as progress was made, the looming trial weighed heavily. The girl was still terrified of the idea of sitting in front of strangers, let alone the man who had silenced her for so long. Every time she thought about it, she froze. The prosecutors wondered if she would manage to speak at all. They considered alternative evidence, other ways to strengthen their case, but in the end, her testimony remained critical. The judge, after hearing arguments from both sides, made an unusual ruling. Justice would be allowed inside the courtroom. It was not a decision made lightly. Some argued it could prejudice the jury, tugging at their emotions too strongly. But the judge knew that the alternative silence from the girl would mean the truth remained buried. If the dog could help her speak, then the risk was worth it. News of the ruling spread quickly, and opinions divided. Some people shook their heads, saying, "What's next? Cats on the witness stand." Others, however, praised the decision, recognizing the courage it might give to a child who had already endured enough. Either way, all eyes turned toward the trial, curious to see whether such an unconventional choice would make any difference. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the girl spent more time with Justice than ever before. She learned how to hold his leash, how to rest her hand against his back when she felt afraid. She practiced walking into an empty courtroom with him, sitting in the witness chair while he lay at her feet. The first time she tried, her voice faltered, tears spilling down her cheeks. But Justice never moved, never wavered. He simply stayed beside her, reminding her with every heartbeat that she wasn't alone. By the time the actual day arrived, something remarkable had happened. The girl wasn't fearless, far from it. But she was ready. She had built a tiny island of courage on the foundation of her bond with Justice. And though the journey ahead would test her more than ever, she knew one thing with certainty. If she couldn't speak to the humans in the room, she could at least speak to the dog. And so, on that fateful morning, when she walked into the courtroom clutching Justice's leash, it was not just a child stepping into the witness stand. It was a child who had endured the unendurable, now holding on to the one anchor that gave her the strength to speak. The gallery saw only a fragile figure in a pale dress and a large, loyal dog at her side. What they could not see, but would soon hear, was that beneath her silence, words were waiting to break free. Words that once spoken would change everything. Justice was no ordinary dog. To the untrained eye, he was simply a large German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, steady amber eyes, and a commanding presence. But behind those calm eyes was a lifetime of training, discipline, and experience that set him apart from ordinary pets. He had worked as a service K9 for years, initially trained for search and rescue, later for police support. His duties had once included tracking suspects and sniffing out narcotics. But when handlers noticed his unusual gentleness with children, his path shifted toward a new role, one that no one had expected, yet one that would prove more vital than anything else. The courtroom on that day had never hosted an animal before. Some jurors shifted uneasily when Justice padded into the room, his claws clicking lightly against the polished floor. A few whispered under their breath, questioning the professionalism of such a choice. But Justice paid no attention to them. His focus was on the small girl who clung to his leash, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly in the leather strap. To him, the crowd didn't matter. The lawyers, the judge, the defendant, none of them mattered. What mattered was her. Justice had been trained to sense stress. He could pick up on the rise and fall of breathing, the trembling of small hands, even the sharp scent of fear. As the girl settled into the witness chair, her hands sliding into his thick fur, he pressed closer, anchoring her with his weight. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't move suddenly or make a sound. He simply shifted, just enough to remind her that he was there. His handler, seated quietly a few feet away, gave him no commands. He didn't need them. The courtroom held its collective breath. Everyone was waiting to see what this unusual team, a frightened child and a patient dog, might accomplish together. The prosecutor began gently, his voice low and careful, asking the simplest of questions. "Do you know why you're here today?" The girl's lips trembled. She looked down at her knees, then sideways at the dog. She said nothing. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the room. The defense attorney leaned back, satisfied. The judge leaned forward, her hands folded, prepared to intervene. But then the girl's fingers curled tighter into Justice's fur. The German shepherd turned his head slightly, resting his chin on her shoes. That small, steady gesture changed everything. It grounded her, gave her something solid to cling to in a room filled with intimidating stares. For months, she had whispered secrets only to him. When adults asked questions, she froze. But when she leaned down to the dog, pressing her lips close to his ear, the words slipped out. "Yes," she whispered. The prosecutor paused, giving her space. "You can answer however you feel most comfortable," he said kindly. "If you need to talk to Justice, that's okay. We can all listen." It was an unusual accommodation, But the judge nodded in agreement. The courtroom adapted itself to the needs of this single child. And so the strangest thing happened. The testimony began, not as answers to adults, but as whispers to a dog. Justice didn't move. He didn't react. That was part of his brilliance. His training taught him never to break the illusion that he was simply listening. His presence was not about theatrics, but about silence. About offering a child the chance to believe that she wasn't talking to a jury of strangers, but to the one companion she trusted most. The defense attorney bristled. He objected, arguing that this was improper, that the jury was being manipulated by emotion. But the judge overruled him firmly. "This child will testify in the way she is able," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Justice remained a quiet constant. When her voice faltered, he steadied her. When she hesitated, he didn't push. His silent companionship created a bubble around her, one that shielded her from the oppressive weight of the courtroom. Even the jurors, initially skeptical, began to see the importance of his presence. Their pens slowed, their faces softened. They weren't just hearing testimony, they were witnessing courage being born in real time. The reporters scribbled furiously, their notes filled with phrases like groundbreaking, unprecedented, and the dog who gave a child her voice. Yet even they struggled to capture the raw emotion of the moment. Words could describe the scene, but only those inside the room could feel the energy shift. When the child leaned into the dog's side and began to speak with more confidence than anyone believed possible. Every so often, Justice would glance toward the accused. It wasn't intentional intimidation. Dogs didn't understand the nuances of guilt or innocence, but his eyes carried a message nonetheless. He wasn't there to attack or accuse. He was there to protect. And as the man shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of both the dog and the little girl, the courtroom saw a new dynamic emerge. The predator no longer seemed powerful. The victim no longer seemed powerless. The girl didn't always look at the jury. She didn't always look at the judge. Most of the time, her gaze stayed fixed on the dog. She would press her face close to his ear, her words barely audible at first. "I was scared," she whispered once. Then louder, "He told me not to tell." The stenographer caught every word. The jurors leaned in, hanging on the details. Justice never broke his stillness. It was as if he knew that his most important role was not to move, not to distract, but to serve as a living anchor. For the girl, he wasn't just a dog. He was the bridge between silence and speech, between fear and truth. The prosecutor, sensing the rhythm of her comfort, adjusted his approach. Instead of directing questions at her like an interrogation, he framed them as though he were asking the dog. "Justice," he would say lightly, "can you tell your friend what happened?" The girl would giggle softly, the tension breaking, and then she would answer. It was unconventional. Yes, but it worked. As the minutes stretched on, the little girl spoke more freely. Her whispers grew louder, her words clearer. Each detail she shared painted a picture that no one in the courtroom could ignore. She was still a child, her language simple, her explanations unpolished, but her honesty rang truer than any polished statement could. And through it all, Justice stayed. He was the constant heartbeat beside her, the silent strength that turned fear into testimony. The courtroom, initially skeptical, now understood. This was no gimmick. This was survival. When a break was finally called, the girl slid off the chair and wrapped her arms around Justice's neck. It was not the stiff, forced hug of a child performing for adults, but the desperate, grateful embrace of someone clinging to the one thing that made her feel safe. The jurors watched quietly, their expressions heavy with respect. Even the judge's eyes softened, though she quickly composed herself before striking the gavel to announce recess. For Justice, it was just another day of doing what he was trained to do. For the little girl, It was everything. He had not spoken a word, yet he had given her a voice. And in that courtroom, filled with tension and fear, the silent roll of a dog was proving to be the loudest truth of all. The hush inside the courtroom was almost unbearable. Even the sound of the judge's pen being placed on the desk echoed too loudly. Every single person, from the stern-faced bailiff to the curious reporters seated in the back, knew this was the moment the trial had been waiting for. The prosecutor, a kind woman with years of experience in cases involving children, leaned forward slightly. Her voice was gentle, carefully measured, so it wouldn't overwhelm the little girl seated in the witness chair. "Sweetheart," she began softly, "do you remember why you're here today?" The girl's eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, then immediately back to the polished wood of the table in front of her. Her small fingers clenched around Justice's thick fur. The dog didn't move. He simply sat steady, his chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, his presence a shield against the world. The silence stretched. The defense attorney shifted impatiently, tapping his pen, but no one else dared to breathe too loudly. The judge, understanding the fragility of the moment, leaned slightly forward from the bench. Her voice was calm, without the stern authority she had used moments earlier. "You can take your time," the judge assured. "No one is rushing you." The girl's lips trembled. She glanced at the man seated just a few feet away, the man who had once made her life a nightmare. He was smirking, his chin lifted slightly, as though he believed she wouldn't have the courage to speak. That smirk was enough to freeze her. Her throat closed up, and for a heartbeat, it seemed she would remain silent, swallowed by her fear. Justice shifted ever so slightly, pressing his massive head against her small shoulder. It was as if he sensed her hesitation, urging her forward with the quiet loyalty only a dog could give. The girl's hand slid down to his ear, stroking the velvet soft fur. Then, for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, she leaned down and whispered. Her words were inaudible to the crowd, but her lips moved against the dog's ear. The prosecutor froze, unsure if she should interrupt. The girl's whisper grew steadier, her eyes locked on Justice, not on the adults around her. Finally, she lifted her head just slightly. Her voice was tiny, almost fragile, but it carried across the silence. I remember," she said. The courtroom seemed to collectively exhale. The prosecutor smiled gently, careful not to overwhelm her. "That's very brave. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about what happened? You don't have to look at anyone but Justice if that makes it easier." The girl nodded once, her hair falling into her face. She lowered her head again, whispering directly to Justice. At first, it seemed she wasn't going to repeat it loud enough for others to hear. But as she stroked his fur, her voice grew stronger. He hurt me," she said finally. Gasps rippled quietly through the audience. The judge immediately raised a hand for silence, her eyes flashing a warning toward the gallery. The prosecutor spoke again, her tone soothing. "You're very brave, sweetheart. You can tell Justice, and we'll listen too, okay?" The girl nodded, her voice trembling, but no longer retreating into silence. "He said I couldn't tell. He said no one would believe me. But Justice believes me. Don't you, boy?" Her little hand tightened on the dog's neck. Justice didn't move except for a slow wag of his tail, the tip thumping against the wooden floor. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his client, whose smirk had begun to fade. The girl's voice wavered, but she pressed her cheek against Justice's head, drawing courage from him as she continued. "I was so scared. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. He told me if I did, he'd hurt Mommy too." A sharp intake of breath came from one of the jurors, quickly muffled. The prosecutor took a careful step forward. "You're safe now." You did the right thing by telling us. Can you keep talking to Justice and just let us hear?" The girl nodded, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she lifted her gaze, not at the accused, not at the jury, but toward the ceiling, as if finding the courage somewhere higher than the fear. She spoke directly into Justice's ear, but loud enough for all to hear. "He can't hurt me anymore, right?" The prosecutor's eyes softened. "That's right. You're safe now." For the first time, the child allowed her words to truly carry. They came out haltingly, sometimes broken by tears, but always steady enough to be understood. She described the nights she was too afraid to sleep, the times she had tried to tell, but no one had believed her, and the moments where she felt invisible. The courtroom was spellbound. Every time her voice faltered, Justice was there, his steady breathing, his warm fur beneath her hand. Each touch seemed to remind her she wasn't alone. Slowly, word by word, she built a bridge out of silence and into truth. The defendant's smirk was gone entirely now, his jaw tightening as her testimony painted a picture too vivid to deny. When she finally paused, her small shoulders shaking with the weight of what she had revealed, Justice gave a low, comforting rumble in his chest. The sound was so gentle, so grounding, that the girl managed to take a breath and continue. Her final words of the day struck harder than anyone expected. Looking directly at Justice, she whispered, "You told me I was brave, and I believe you." The courtroom, though ordered to remain silent, was filled with the sound of muffled sobs, quiet sniffles, and the shuffle of tissues pulled hastily from pockets. Even the judge's stern expression softened. For the first time in the entire trial, the little girl smiled. A tiny, fleeting smile, but one that glowed with relief. And though she had spoken to Justice, every soul in that courtroom had heard her. The silence that followed the little girl's first words lingered like a storm cloud ready to break. People were leaning forward in their seats, hardly daring to breathe, as though one sound might shatter her fragile courage. Even the judge, who had presided over hundreds of cases, looked less like a figure of stern authority and more like a grandmother trying to hold back her emotions. The prosecutor crouched slightly, lowering herself so she wasn't towering above the child. Her voice was quiet, gentle. "You're doing so well," she said softly. "You're very brave. If you feel ready, you can keep telling Justice what happened. We're listening, sweetheart. Every word matters." The girl didn't look at her. She didn't look at the jury, or the defense attorney, or the man sitting a few feet away. Her eyes were locked on Justice, her hand stroking the dog's fur in slow, rhythmic movements. The dog sat motionless, his brown eyes steady, his breathing calm. He was her anchor. Taking a shaky breath, the girl leaned close to the dog's ear. "He told me I wasn't allowed to talk. He said if I did, he'd come back and hurt me worse." The words were barely above a whisper, but the microphone on the table caught them, carrying her voice through the courtroom. A low gasp swept across the gallery. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. Hearsay. Overruled," the judge snapped, her gavel striking once. Her eyes never left the child. "The testimony stands." The girl's fingers trembled, but she pressed her cheek against Justice's head and kept speaking. "He came into my room at night. He said I had to be quiet. If I cried, he got angry. I thought it was my fault." Her small voice cracked on the last word. A juror in the front row lifted a hand to his face, hiding the tears welling in his eyes. The prosecutor swallowed hard. "Sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. Nothing. Can you tell Justice what happened so we can understand?" The girl nodded, her chest rising and falling too quickly. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat back into silence. Then she whispered into Justice's ear again, only this time. Her voice carried farther, steadier, like she wanted the whole room to hear. "He touched me," she said, her words trembling. "He made me do things I didn't want to do. He said nobody would believe me, because I was just a little kid. But justice believes me." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, muffled cries, the scrape of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably, all blending into a storm of sound. The judge slammed her gavel, her voice booming. "Order! Order in the court!" The noise fell back into silence, though the weight of her words still pressed heavy against the walls. The defendant shifted in his chair, his once cocky smirk now replaced by a pale, stony expression. His eyes darted toward the jury, then back to the girl, as though realizing for the first time that his world was collapsing. The prosecutor gave the child a moment, then gently asked, "Do you remember what he told you, if you ever tried to tell?" The girl nodded, her lower lip trembling. "He said he'd hurt my mommy. He said he'd take her away, and I'd never see her again." The courtroom grew so quiet that even the hum of the ceiling lights could be heard. "And why didn't you tell anyone sooner?" the prosecutor asked softly. Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks. She pressed her face into Justice's fur before answering. "Because I thought maybe it would stop. But it didn't. And then I thought maybe no one would care. But Justice cares. He listens." Justice lifted his head then, as though acknowledging her words, and licked her small hand. The movement was so simple, so full of loyalty, that several people in the gallery openly sobbed. The prosecutor's voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it. "You're very brave for telling us. You're not alone anymore. Do you feel safe now, sitting with Justice?" The girl nodded fiercely, clutching the dog's neck. "I feel safe with him. He keeps me strong. And I know he won't let me down." Her words were like a knife cutting through the courtroom. This wasn't just testimony. It was the unshakable truth of a child who had endured more than anyone should, and who had found her voice in the most unexpected companion. The defense attorney rose again, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, this is—" The judge silenced him with a single look. "Sit down. You will not intimidate this witness." For the first time, the child looked up not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, but directly at the man accused of hurting her. Her tiny hand remained firm on Justice's head as she whispered, louder now, "You can't scare me anymore. Not when he's here." The accused shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing with anger. For a brief moment, the mask of arrogance slipped, and the jury saw the truth. The little girl turned back to Justice, her face softening again. "I told you I was too scared. But you were right. I am brave." The gallery erupted again, not in noise this time, but in emotion. Tears streamed down faces, tissues crumpled in hands, and even the bailiff swallowed hard, his stern composure cracking. The judge's voice, though firm, held the faintest tremor as she said, "The testimony stands. This court will hear every word this child has to say." The little girl, having unburdened herself of secrets she should never have carried, leaned into Justice's warm body. For the first time, her sobs weren't from fear, but from release of a silence that had held her prisoner. And the entire courtroom, every soul within it, knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The smallest voice had spoken the loudest truth. The silence that followed her words was like nothing anyone had ever felt in that courtroom before. It wasn't the silence of boredom or waiting. It was the heavy, unbearable quiet that falls when truth crashes down and no one dares to breathe. Every single person in the room had heard the child's voice, fragile, yet unbreakable, cutting through years of fear. And in those words, she had shifted the balance of the trial. The jurors sat frozen, their faces pale. A few had watery eyes, blinking rapidly as though to maintain their composure. One woman, seated at the end of the jury box, had a trembling hand pressed against her chest. She had children of her own. She didn't need legal arguments or piles of evidence. The little girl's words had carved themselves into her heart. At the prosecution's table, the attorney's jaw clenched. She had prepared for this, had prayed the girl would find her voice, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer weight of that testimony. It wasn't just a recounting of abuse, it was a declaration of survival. The defense attorney, on the other hand, looked as though he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed as he rifled through papers, desperate for an objection. Any objection that might slow the momentum. But nothing came. There was no legal trick to undo what had just been said. The accused himself slumped slightly, his earlier arrogance stripped away. The sneer was gone, replaced by a stony, pale silence. He avoided eye contact with the jury now, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The judge let the moment linger. Her eyes scanned the room, first the gallery, then the jury, then the defense. Finally, she turned her gaze back to the child. "You are very brave," she said firmly, her voice carrying authority yet filled with rare warmth. "This court thanks you for your testimony." The little girl didn't look at the judge. She leaned against Justice, whispering something into his ear. The German shepherd's tail gave a slow wag against the wooden floor, steady and grounding. The prosecutor leaned forward again. "Sweetheart, do you need a break? Or do you feel strong enough to keep talking to Justice?" The girl wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. Her voice cracked, but there was a new steadiness in it. "I want to keep going. I want him." She pointed a trembling finger toward the defendant without looking directly at him. "To hear what he did." The defendant flinched, as though struck by invisible force. The courtroom collectively held its breath again. The prosecutor nodded. "All right. Tell Justice. We'll listen." The girl's voice wavered, but she spoke. "He told me no one would care, that I wasn't important, but look." She gestured toward the rows of jurors, the judge, the prosecutor. "They're all here listening." So he was wrong. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried more power than any lawyer's closing argument could have. A low murmur spread through the gallery, people whispering to one another, overwhelmed by the child's courage. The bailiff barked, "Order!" But even his stern voice couldn't erase the human reaction. The judge raised her gavel, but hesitated, watching the girl instead. She allowed the moment to stretch, understanding that silencing the murmurs would be like silencing the waves after a storm. This was bigger than procedure. It was truth breaking free. The defense attorney finally stood, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The judge cut him off. "Sit down, counselor. This child is testifying under extraordinary circumstances. You will not interfere." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, defeated. Justice remained still, his calm presence grounding the girl. She stroked his ear, drawing courage from the warmth beneath her hand. "When I thought I couldn't tell anyone, I told him," she whispered, nodding at the dog. "He listened. He made me feel safe. And now I know it wasn't my fault." That sentence hit the courtroom harder than anything else. The words of a child, declaring her innocence against the shadow of manipulation, echoed in every ear. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching across notepads. One cameraman in the hallway outside leaned toward the small window of the courtroom door, desperate to capture every detail in his notes. Jurors exchanged glances. They weren't supposed to, but it was human instinct. Each face mirrored the same expression: shock, heartbreak, and the undeniable recognition that the little girl's testimony was true. For a moment, the judge's eyes softened, betraying her humanity beneath the robe. "You are not at fault," she said quietly, but firmly enough for the record. "You have done a great service today." The child leaned into Justice, whispering again, Those close enough could barely make it out. We did it, didn't we? Justice, as if answering, pressed his head against her chest. It was too much for some. One juror discreetly wiped her tears with a handkerchief. A man in the gallery dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking. Even one of the uniformed officers stationed by the door shifted his gaze to the ceiling, blinking furiously. The defense attorney tried once more. Your Honor, the emotional influence of this dog is... The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. Counselor, if you speak again out of turn, I will hold you in contempt. This testimony is both relevant and admissible. Do not insult this court or this child's courage. Silence fell again, heavier than before. The little girl, despite her trembling frame, had become the center of the entire trial. No legal argument could outweigh the truth spoken in that small, steady voice. And everyone in the room, judge, jury, gallery, felt it. The tide had turned. From that moment on, the case was no longer about clever arguments or cross-examinations. It was about a child who had found her voice in the most unlikely place through the steady heartbeat of a police dog. The smallest voice had pierced the darkest silence, and the courtroom would never forget it. The trial stretched on for days after the little girl's testimony, but in truth, the moment she spoke was the moment the case was decided. Every witness that followed, every piece of evidence presented, seemed only to echo the words that had already pierced the courtroom. The jury listened, but their minds and hearts were still on the child who had whispered her pain into the ear of a loyal dog. By the time closing arguments arrived, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. The prosecutor rose first, her hands steady on the podium. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice strong but threaded with emotion. This case is not about complicated evidence. It is not about technicalities or loopholes. It is about truth. And you heard that truth from the bravest witness I have ever known, a child who should never have had to sit in that chair. She told you what happened, not to gain sympathy, but because she finally felt safe enough to speak. And she told you the truth while looking into the eyes of the only one who never failed her dog, Justice. If you remember anything, remember that her words were pure, uncoached, and undeniable. You must ask yourselves, who benefits from lying, and who benefits from courage? The answer is clear. She was brave, so that he could never hurt her again. Now it is your turn to be brave. Deliver justice. Her words hung in the air like a plea and a command all at once. The defense attorney rose next, his earlier confidence completely eroded. His tie sat crooked, his voice lacked conviction. The testimony of a child, he said, fumbling with his notes, while emotional, cannot be the sole basis for. He faltered under the glares of the jury. He knew as well as they did that his words had already lost. His client's fate was sealed the moment the little girl had spoken. When both sides rested, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, people debating how long it would take. Some predicted hours, others thought perhaps a full day. But those who had sat through every moment, who had felt the gravity of the child's words, suspected it wouldn't take long at all. The little girl sat quietly outside the courtroom with Justice at her side. She wasn't allowed in for the verdict, but her mother held her hand tightly in the waiting room. Reporters swarmed the hallways, whispering of how unprecedented it had been. A child speaking so powerfully through the comfort of a police dog. Inside the jury room, there was little debate. The foreperson, a man with graying hair and eyes red from holding back tears, set down the first ballot. "We don't need to argue, do we?" he asked softly. One by one heads shook. The evidence, the testimony, the undeniable humanity of it all, it was unanimous. Less than 2 hours later, the buzzer sounded, summoning the judge, the attorneys, and the gallery back into the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, like a storm about to break. The accused sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes darted between the jury box and the floor, refusing to meet the stares of the gallery. "All rise," the bailiff commanded as the jury filed back in. The little girl was brought in too, her mother walking beside her. Though she had been told she didn't need to be there, she had asked to sit with Justice to see this through. The judge had granted it, recognizing the importance of closure. The jury foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper in his hands. His voice shook slightly, but his words were clear. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words slammed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted, some gasped, others wept, a few clapped before being hushed by the bailiff. The prosecutor closed her eyes in relief, shoulders sagging under the release of months of tension. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, defeated. The defendant himself cursed under his breath, slamming a fist on the table, but the bailiff's firm hand on his shoulder reminded him that his freedom was gone. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Order, order in the court." She raised her gavel, but didn't strike it immediately. Instead, she turned to the jury, her expression solemn. "You have delivered justice. This court thanks you for your service." Then, her eyes softened as she looked at the child, seated in the witness chair, once more with Justice's head resting in her lap. "You," she said gently, breaking from protocol for a moment, "are the bravest witness this courtroom has ever seen. You have given us all a reminder of why we are here, to protect, to uphold truth, and to deliver justice. You may walk out of here with your head held high." The little girl looked down at Justice, her small lips curling into the faintest smile. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The wag of Justice's tail against the wooden floor said enough. Her mother gathered her into her arms, tears streaming down her face. "It's over, baby. It's over," she whispered into her daughter's hair. The little girl's voice, quiet but firm, replied, "No, it's not over. It's just the beginning. I can be brave now." Justice gave a soft, approving bark that drew a ripple of emotional laughter from the gallery. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed outside the courtroom, and within hours, the story would dominate headlines. "Little girl testifies with police dog by her side, verdict brings justice." But for those inside that room, it wasn't about headlines. It was about a truth that had finally been spoken, a silence that had finally been broken, and the undeniable fact that sometimes the smallest voices echo the loudest. The defendant was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. The jurors filed out, their duty done, their hearts heavy but proud. And in the center of it all, a little girl and her dog sat quietly, unshaken by the storm they had just endured. The gavel struck once more, final and firm. Court is adjourned. It was over. And yet, for the little girl, it was the start of something new. Life after silence, life after fear. The courthouse emptied slowly that day, but the echoes of the verdict lingered long after the final gavel strike. The little girl and her mother walked out into the crisp autumn air, their hands entwined, Justice trotting loyally beside them. Reporters swarmed instantly, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, questions tumbling over one another. "Ma'am, how do you feel about the verdict? What does this mean for your daughter's future? Can you describe the role Justice played in the trial?" The mother held her daughter close, shielding her from the frenzy. "No comment," she whispered firmly, as she tried to guide her through the crowd. But the little girl, tiny and fragile, placed her small hand on Justice's back and looked at the sea of cameras. She didn't speak, but the way she clutched the dog's fur, her head tilted slightly toward him, said more than words could. Justice's calm, unwavering presence was the only answer needed. That image, a child embracing the dog who had helped her find her courage, was captured by every camera there. By evening, it appeared on television screens and newspapers across the country. Headlines screamed, "Bravery in the courtroom. Child testifies with K9 by her side." The story spread beyond the small town, crossing state lines and reaching people who had never set foot in a courtroom. It struck something raw, something universal. For the little girl, though, the days that followed weren't about news or headlines. They were about returning home. Her own bed. Her toys scattered across the floor. Her favorite pink blanket tucked under her chin. But it didn't feel exactly the same. The air in the house seemed lighter, safer, as though the walls themselves knew the danger had passed. Nights were easier. The shadows no longer chased her quite as fiercely, though sometimes she still woke gasping, her heart racing. On those nights, Justice would visit with his handler, stretching across her bedroom floor like a silent guardian. She would slip out of bed, curl against his side, and fall back asleep to the sound of his steady breathing. Therapy sessions, once unbearable, became easier. She began to speak in fragments and sentences, then whole stories. Each word was another piece of the weight lifted from her chest. One night, as her mother tucked her in, the little girl whispered, "Mom, do you think Justice knew what I told him in court?" Her mother froze, emotion tightening her throat. She smoothed the girl's hair back and kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he knew every word. He always knew you were brave. He just helped you believe it too." Justice wagged his tail softly, his brown eyes glistening as if in agreement. Months later came the sentencing. The defendant was given a long prison term, enough to ensure he would never hurt her or anyone else again. The courtroom felt different this time, lighter, almost victorious. The judge acknowledged the child's bravery in her closing remarks, calling her testimony the linchpin of the entire case. The little girl, though she didn't grasp the legal details, understood one thing: the man who scared her would never come near her again. The case left ripples behind it. Advocacy groups began to point to her testimony as proof of what could happen when children were given the right kind of support. A new bill, informally dubbed Justice's Law, was drafted in the state legislature, calling for therapy and police dogs to be made available for child witnesses in court. What had seemed like an unusual allowance by one compassionate judge now became a movement. Across the country, courtrooms began to open their doors to support animals, recognizing that the smallest voices often needed the biggest help to be heard. The little girl didn't care about laws or politics. What mattered was that she could sleep at night without fear. Yet even in her small world, she began to notice the change around her. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now knocked at her door with casseroles, gifts, or simple embraces. At school, whispers still trailed her, but something else happened too. One afternoon, a classmate approached her quietly on the playground. "My uncle hurt me too," the girl admitted softly, her eyes darting nervously. "But I didn't tell anyone." The little survivor looked at her for a long time, then reached out and hugged her. "You're really brave," the classmate whispered. "You told. Maybe I can too." In that moment, the little girl realized her courage had not been for herself alone. It had opened a door for others. Justice was celebrated too. He appeared at school safety assemblies, community events, and even on local news. Children flocked to pet him, parents asked about him, and officers proudly shared his story. The police department, once cautious about placing dogs in such sensitive roles, now doubled down on its commitment. More dogs were trained, more handlers assigned, and more children offered the same comfort she had found. Time, as always, carried her forward. The nightmares dulled, her voice grew steadier, and her laughter returned. Therapy continued, but it wasn't heavy silence anymore. It was drawings, conversations, even games. One afternoon, she sat in the grass with Justice during a follow-up visit. Stroking his fur, she looked up at his handler and asked, "Do you think I could train dogs like him when I grow up?" The handler smiled warmly. "I think you'd be perfect for it. You already know how powerful they are." Her eyes lit up, and for the first time, she began to imagine a future filled with purpose, not pain. Years passed, as she carried her childhood memory not as a wound, but as a badge of courage. She grew into someone who understood deeply the importance of being believed, the power of speaking up, and the extraordinary way a dog's quiet companionship could change everything. Her story found its way into training manuals for prosecutors and social workers. Experts discussed her case at conferences and universities. But its most powerful legacy was invisible. Every child, in courtrooms across the country, who reached down to steady trembling fingers in soft fur and found their voice. Justice worked for years after her trial, faithfully supporting child after child. When he finally retired, he lived peacefully with his handler, often visited by the girl who had once leaned on him to face her worst fear. On his last day, now a teenager, she knelt by his side with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered into his ear. Justice, frail but loyal to the end, wagged his tail one last time. Her story was not just about a verdict or even a law. It was about the bond between a child and a dog, a bond strong enough to carry the truth into the open, strong enough to shatter silence, strong enough to change lives. She moved forward with her life, healing, growing, and dreaming. And whenever doubt crept in, she remembered the day she stood in court, terrified yet unbroken, and found her courage not because she wasn't afraid, but because she wasn't alone. Sometimes justice is more than a verdict on paper. Sometimes justice is the steady heartbeat of a dog who helps you believe in your own voice.